Hi everyone, so my name is Christina Basias. I'm an English teacher at Brooklyn College Academy and I'm also a professor at Brooklyn College. I'm going to walk you through what it takes to make a good lesson plan according to using the Danielson Lesson Plan template. I'm going to give you an example of one that's filled out and we're going to do a side-by-side comparison of it. And I'm also going to show you an alternate version of how it could be done. And if you have any questions, I also have contact information at the end of the video. Hope that you enjoy. Be back in a second. Hi everyone, so today we are going to be going over the Danielson Lesson Plan template and one that's filled out. As you can see on the left hand side, it is filled out already and we are going to go through it to compare to the blank version on this side. So as we go through it, I'm going to explain what each section means, why it's significant, and what the best way to fill it out is. And for your viewing pleasure, you could also see one that is filled out, and we'll be going through each section together so you can see an example live as we go through each section. So up here on the top, on the right-hand side on the template, you can see that this is just an example, but that's not necessary for you since you have an example on the left-hand side too. But unit, class, what's going to be the unit that this lesson plan is going off from. Again, this is the Danielson Lesson Plan. It goes through all of the Danielson domains if you fill it out correctly. So here we have unit class, English 9, A Talk to Teachers by James Baldwin, another example by English 4, The Blue Sky by Toni Morrison. So basically, what is the overarching unit that this lesson plan is a part of? Essential questions would be the big questions that have no answer, that are really the crux of your unit or the crux of your lesson. So as you can see here on the left-hand side, what or who determines the standards of a society? Essential questions have no yes or no answer. They are broad. Usually they're about life. They teach us something. Again, this is in the perspective of an English classroom. You could do something like this in science or mathematics. How does form influence expression? If you're talking about a snake, for instance, and there's lots of different ways, but essential questions are necessary for the questioning part of Danielson as well. So aim and do now. What's going to be the goal of the lesson? So for the one on the left-hand side, who has the power in determining a standard of beauty? So depending on what your aim or what your goal is going to be, you can put that here. This is just basically, you can consider this kind of like the title of your lesson plan. What is going to be the main focus of the specific lesson for that day? And then the date is obvious. What day is this lesson taking place? So that's the basic stuff. But let's go through the next sections here. This is where it starts to get really interesting. So what are going to be the objectives of this lesson? So what do you want students to be able to come away with? Students will be able to do what? What's going to be your focus? So here on the left-hand side, this person writes, identify standard use of beauty, define, attribute, depict a standard, determine that there are more than just beauty standards, analyze who sets these standards of society, explain why these standards exist, understand what it means to fall outside of the standards and what society's reaction is. So clearly, this is not something that directly is about a text itself. This is something that's going to lead into a text, and that's okay, because that is necessary. So for you, what are you going to want students to be able to do as a result of this lesson? They aren't always going to be questions that set up a lesson. It could be students who will be able to add equations together, or students will be able to identify geographically where New York State is located. Students will be able to, what is going to be the thing that students will come away doing? Excuse me, that's the bell. Resources and materials. So this one's fairly obvious and it has been done in different ways. I've seen teachers highlight and leave the materials that they don't use in the lesson plan, or you could just exit out as this lesson plan does here on the left-hand side. But it's really up to you. What are you going to use in the lesson? Obviously here, this person just put X's next to everything that they were going to use during this lesson. But you really need to consider when you're planning your lesson, what are going to be the necessary components that I'm going to need? What are the necessary resources and materials that will make up my classroom? What am I going to be relying on as my lesson continues? So here we have on the left-hand side pictures, illustrations, audio-visual, YouTube clips, dictionaries, printed materials, worksheets, Google Docs, right? By the way, using digital electronics in the classroom or educational technology in the classroom is something that is very commended in classrooms, and you would need for an EdTPA submission. Rubrics are super necessary. If you are going to be grading something, you need a rubric. Once again, if you are going to be grading something, you need a rubric. So make sure that you would add something like that in. Are you having a smart board? This would be a great time to do that. Sometimes they're called Triumph board. An easy way to do this would be interactive whiteboard. Are you going to be using an assessment? This one is a digital assessment like Google Forms, Google Classroom. If you're using a website, you could add that here. If you're using Chromebooks in the classroom or any kind of laptop or iPad in the classroom, or if students are using devices in the classroom, this is where you'd put that there. So again, any resources that you are using, do not be scared to list them down. This is where it would be necessary to put them down. I would recommend deleting the extra space, but it really doesn't matter. That's just a visual preference. Okay, so as I scroll down, you'll see on the left-hand side it says content standards. On the right-hand side it says Common Core standards. There's more than one way to do this. I just want to emphasize that. I've seen examples of just Common Core standards listed here and then their descriptors here. I've seen this actually deleted where it's only the right-hand side listing the Common Core standards and their descriptions. As you can see, it's not necessary to list out the actual descriptors of the Common Core standards. As long as you list the standard in your lesson plan, that's what's necessary. So you really need to go back to whatever your Common Core strand is and be specific about which Common Core standards you're using. I can't stress that enough, but again, this is not necessary. You don't need to actually use the verbiage. It makes your lesson plan more lengthy, but that is completely up to you. That is a personal preference. But once again, you must list your Common Core standards. That is absolutely essential. When you're thinking about your Common Core standards, I really want you to go back to here when you're thinking about your objectives, and I want you to think about what are your students coming away with, and how does the Common Core standards impact that? Where do the Common Core standards come alive with what your students are able to come away with? You'll be surprised how much your Common Core standards are actually impacted with what your students are able to come away with. And I also want you to think about the lesson itself as it takes place, as your lesson is taking place. What are students doing that are also part of your Common Core standards? Okay, so this right here, these three sections are this whole first page. So as you can see, there's a lot of excess material on the Danielson Lesson Plan that you will not need. All right. So now we're on to page 2 of the Danielson Lesson Plan. And as you can see here, same thing, Danielson Lesson Plan walks you through what you're going to be needing in this class. How are you going to be doing this class? It literally walks you through everything you will need to think about for a successful lesson. Here you're thinking about, well, how am I going to be organizing my groups? Am I organizing my groups at times by a whole class? Am I organizing them at times by a small class? Am I organizing them at times in pairs if I'm asking them to think and share together? Think, pair, share. Am I organizing them by ability? That's called organizing groups homogeneously if you're organizing them by ability because they're at the same ability level. Or you're organizing them just randomly in proximity. Now notice that this person has a few things, and it might seem contradictory. However, as you go on with this person's lesson plan, it becomes very clear that there are times where she or he is engaging the whole class. There are times when they are engaging small groups. There are times when there are think, pair, shares. There's times when the groups are arranged by ability, are given certain handouts that are differentiated in that way. So I want you to be very mindful of what you choose in the grouping section, and you have a bunch of options, and notice that whatever is not used, this person does take out. Again, it's just a preference, but there are many options for you to think about. And you may, as you do your lesson plan, think, oh, well, actually, I would like to do the student's preference of a partner instead of viability. If that's something that's going to inform your lesson plan, then that's great. But later on, we'll get to the description of what you're going to need to put down. So now we're up to differentiation. So when you think about differentiation is basically how will you, as the leader and educator of the classroom, make sure that your instruction is tailored to meet all of your students' individual needs. And there's many ways to do this. You could do this by having engaging activities where students are standing up, where it's interactive, where you have different question types. So once again, the Danielson Lesson Plan actually walks you through different examples of differentiated activities. By all means, is this not the complete list of everything possible? You can always add in differentiated activities, but the Danielson Lesson Plan does give you some examples that you can use. So varied activities, visual clues, scaffolded questions, rubrics, question types, levels of questions, resources with different texts and vocabulary lists, learning style that you cater to, graphic organizers. So really be mindful about how does your classroom look? Imagine as you do your lesson plan the visual representation of your classroom and what differentiation you imagine taking place. So here, this person puts down activities are varied, there's visual clues, there's scaffolded questions, rubrics, there's grouping, which is explained later, graphic organizers, and things are also done by skill level, which means to me, just reading this without having read further, that certain activities are actually specifically broken down and given to certain students with their certain skills that they are able to achieve. I mean, if you think about it, you wouldn't give a student that doesn't know how to write an essay the task of writing an essay. You would give them something that's below that, but something that they are reaching, something that is a little above what they are able to do right now to challenge them, but that they are capable of. So really be mindful about what you're going to be using in this box. All right, so as we move our way down this list from differentiation and go towards assessment, you can see that the Danielson Lesson Plan once again gives us boxes of what we should consider when we're thinking about how our instruction is going to be informed, either while we're in the classroom or how we are going to sum up the information that students received and how do we know they understood that. So typically, there's actually two ways that assessment is done. It is done formatively, that is called formative assessment, and then there is summative assessment. Here is primarily formative assessment that is taking place, but it has sprinkles of summative if you were to use it that way. So formative assessment, to be clear, is like diagnostic testing. It typically involves qualitative feedback. That means that you typically here it's really hard to collect the data. It's more qualitative information that informs your instruction and sometimes can happen instantaneously. For example, if a student has their head down, you notice as a teacher, if that's a formative assessment, that you want to go there and tap on their desk. They may not be attentive to the material. Or, for example, if you ask questions and no one is participating, that will be a time for you to scaffold your question and make it even simpler. So these are just two examples of formative assessment taking place, and they're more exit tickets, strategic questioning, like we just said, 3, 2, 1, like 3 things you learned, 2 things that you still don't understand, 1 question that you still have. There are many ways to go about this. So as you can see, there's many options of what you can do. This person chooses a lot, 12 of them actually, and even clarifies that it will be happening during instruction. There will be clarifying questions. You can summarize orally to partners. So there's a lot of options here, but again, this is primarily formative. Summative assessments is about evaluating students' learning. For example, if you were to click here, the homework option, which I know is right here, if so you could use this as formative. Again, it's qualitative. If you were to use it as a summative, that means that you would be grading this homework and it would be inputted into your grade book, and you will be evaluating how well students understood the material that day, because your specific lesson that day, students will be able to add numbers, multiply, understand the different ways that beauty informs society or something. It's really, how are you going to be evaluating what they learned on that specific day? So really be mindful about what you're choosing here. Again, it's okay if you choose summative and formative together. This will have to be explained down here, which we will get to in a moment. So still working our way down. This is a slightly modified Danielson lesson plan, and I included actually the description of grouping, differentiation, and the description of the assessment plan, because some of these things might not be clear, excuse me. So you could have all of these X's filled out, but someone walking into your room may not actually understand why you're doing the things that you're doing. So it is a best practice to be sure that you explain your thinking. This is the time to clarify anything that might be unclear. This is the time to clarify if you chose homeworks and wait time as your only assessment plans, why those are your only assessment plans. That's a horrible example, but you want to be sure that you explain yourself thoroughly. I cannot emphasize that enough. This way, there are no questions for someone walking into a room like, why did you do this? Well, oh, I don't know. Well, no, you have to put it down here. This is the moment of glory for you, your thinking, your rationale, because the rest of this is the lesson that's about to take place. The rest of these pages is just a lesson plan. This is the only other place where you could explain your thinking to someone that's walking into your classroom. So you want to be sure that you explain your thinking. So as you can see, and you can pause this video if you need to, how this person explains their thinking. Group by ability, they're grouped homogeneously, as we spoke about, pairs or trios, small groups. So all of these things that this person actually highlighted upstairs on this document is actually bolded and made very specific, so there is no room for misinterpretation. Same thing here. Everything is laid out. It is so simple. This is beautiful. Formative assessment, teacher circulates, comprehension, clarifying projects, group projects, which will be their summative assessment, it sounds like. So be specific about why you chose all of these things. This is your time. This is where you're going to explain all of that. So, excuse me, I'm going to move on to this page. Actually, this should go down. So as you will notice here, this aim, who has the power in determining the standard of beauty, is actually the same. Who has the power in determining the standard of beauty? So whatever you wrote on that first page is going to be rewritten here. Do now is, what are your students going to be working on the moment that they walk into the class? There's always going to be aim, there's going to be do now, and or a homework if you're going to be assigning a homework. What are students going to be working on? So your do now should typically be something that reinforces the day's lesson, a base question to go off of that will help your content grow as your lesson progresses. It must be something, I think, engaging enough for students to be immersed in the material, get their feet wet, and then the rest of your lesson, it comes to life. So you really need to think about what is that going to be. For this lesson, there is a beauty and preliminary survey discussion, which is on a Google form, hence why this person's using educational technology and getting students to think about beauty. So basically, what are your standards of beauty on a scale of 5 to 1? Is this beautiful? Is this not beautiful? So as you can see, this person is playing with these ideas, again, in order to set up these standards of society that seem to be very essential for this lesson that's happening. And you don't have to, you don't necessarily have had to have read James Baldwin's piece in order to understand that. It's made very clear that this is a setup lesson just by what the detail that's being implemented here in this lesson plan. Also notice how detailed this is by saying teacher will in parentheses. Sometimes I find that incoming teachers have a very difficult time with writing their ideas down because they're not sure who's doing what. Are my students doing this? Am I doing this? So this is a best practice of saying teacher will do this, right? And saying that teachers are going to be having this certain role while they are in the classroom, and students will have this certain role while they are in the classroom. This is a personal choice. It is up to you how you want to do this, but I find that when student teachers or incoming teachers do this, it ends up being and working in their favor. All right, so let's go down. This do now, notice 7 to 10 minutes. She played around with the time. You can play around with the time yourself as well, moving down. So this is also okay, leaving some time for wiggle room, 7 to 10 minutes. Sometimes you can plan for 5 minutes. Doesn't mean that it's going to end in 5 minutes. I wouldn't abuse that. 7 to 10 is a nice window. But just consider, in a realistic environment, how long should it take you? A best practice is also to do the activity yourself before you assign it to your students so you can see how long it will take you as well. So a mini lesson is something that takes place right after the do now. That is the instructional activity of that day. After the instructional activity of that day, that's when some other activity happens to reinforce the mini lesson that just took place. So here we have assess the standard of beauty. This is a discussion about all of what just happened here. So this is where the teacher addresses, well, beauty is actually socially constructed in our society and is reinforced with definitions and a lesson surrounding these ideas that got their feet wet here in the do now. So it's a great example of, okay, well, let's discuss this lesson. Let's all really think about these standards of beauty. This person even has a picture of this person and asks them about, well, is this person beautiful? What do you think? What about this body evolution video? And shows them this video, hence again, educational technology, to get them engaged in thinking. And it's okay to also anticipate what students' answers will be as well. That's another best practice that incoming teachers should do. So this is, again, a really deep example of how this is done. This is not how yours has to look. Mini lesson, once again, what is going to be the content that your students are learning that day? What is the content they are learning that day? The do now can get them to an immersion, or it could also be a refresher of a previous activity they already learned. And here in the next section, after the mini lesson, is the activity that will reinforce the lesson that was just taught. All right, so as we go through, it's very obvious what happens after this group work happens, or it doesn't necessarily have to be group work, but group work is a really great way to reinforce a lesson that was just taught. Danielson states that working in groups or constructing ideas together, it hits the Danielson domains very highly effective, very on the scale of highly effective. So I would certainly encourage you to do group work in this section. This person also does group work and also differentiates the group work that is being assigned. This would be a place where some of your descriptions of your differentiated plans does come to life. So I really want you to be mindful again about what your groups are going to be doing. Here, students are moving into small groups and they're writing a collaborative paragraph. So we just discussed the mini lesson. In this section, this is where the mini lesson will be reinforced. So this section does not necessarily have to be group work. However, if you're doing group work, it is highly effective in the Danielson framework, in the Danielson domains, because students together construct material, learning together, working together, thinking from one another. This shouldn't really ever be a case where this is 100% teacher-led. The best classes are the ones where students come up with the material themselves. So as you can see here, you have advanced and basic. So you have the differentiated activity actually in the place that reinforces the mini lesson that just took place. So I really want you to think about, how are you going to make your lesson come to life? How are your activities that you use here going to reinforce this mini lesson? In what way are students going to show you that they learn the material, and how are you going to assess that? This is, again, really where that description part of your plan is going to come to life. And then at the end, you have this quick summary. Before we get there, notice how this person includes their rubric. So clearly this is how students are going to be graded while they are doing this activity. This is not the rubric here. This is the differentiated activity that's happening. You have advanced and basic, as we discussed before, and the rubric appears in the lesson plan itself. This is a real great best practice that you should really consider as you do your lesson plans. Whatever you are going to be grading your students on, you need to make sure that you include that. Again, there should be no room for interpretation. And so this is a great example of that. And there's still explanation that takes place throughout the lesson plan. Okay. And then in summary, what this person decides to do is they give an exit ticket to recognize who enforces power. And look at their exit ticket. It really ends up being a standards exit slip that asks them if they understood all of these ideas. So students now actually have the authority over their own learning, which is absolutely fantastic, about did they understand and why. So I can do this, I'm ready to move on, or I think I need more practice, or I think I need more help, and they even are given the time to explain, which is not necessary, but it's a awesome example of giving students this autonomy over their own learning and the expression, and it's of their own learning as well. And notice how there is a name, but it doesn't necessarily have to have a name. It could be anonymous if the teacher decided to do so. So there's a lot to play around with here. So at the end, this is just one example of how this is done on the left-hand side, but on the right-hand side, there's a summary, poses a question to his students based on the activity that was just done. That's just one way that you could do it. It could be an ending question. It could be one question. If you vary it, this is also a differentiated exit slip. You can say that it's differentiated as well. So I really need you to be mindful that how is your lesson going to close? You need to leave time for a closing. It's kind of like wrapping the bow on a present. How are you going to be wrapping this bow on your lesson plan, if that makes any sense? And so here at the end, you have 3 additional more tabs. You have homework, notes, and thoughts about the lesson. So notes and thoughts about the lesson is really an optional piece of the Danielson lesson plan template. Again, the template is crafted so you have the ability to think about every single piece of lesson planning and why every single piece of lesson planning is important in its own distinctive way. So for homework, is there going to be a follow-up with this activity or with this lesson that the students learned today? And if so, what is that going to be? Here, they're going to be reading, as we said and anticipated from the beginning, that this was clearly a setup lesson because it did not address the specific nuances of the text. They're reading the text and they're writing down 3 of the societal standards. So this is great. This is a great example of a homework that reinforces something that was provided earlier in the lesson, the ideas that were provided earlier in the lesson, which were clearly deep and about, standards of beauty that are going to be addressed, it seems, in Baldwin's A Talk to Teachers. So here, notes, this person talks about, maybe things that are happening in the lesson. Again, this is another place that could be clarification, but it's not necessary. They can just be, just to clarify in these specific pieces, this happened. Sure, you could do that. Thoughts about the lesson typically happen after a lesson is given. It's something that you go back to. Another best practice for teachers is, especially new teachers, is reflecting on how a lesson went immediately after the lesson is completed. Now, why this is the best practice is because if you were to reteach this lesson again in the future, you have something to go back to. You have something to say to yourself, okay, well, I know that the first time I did this is the thing that didn't work because, and this would be the section where you'd find that. So actually you'd go from the bottom of your lesson plan and then go back. But this is a great practice to do. Sometimes people like to do it as they do their lesson. Here, this person actually puts down their thoughts on the lesson plan. This will act as a preliminary lesson. That's really not necessary. This is just what they decided to do. But again, this typically I would reserve for after a lesson plan is done. I've done this many times myself where I give a lesson and there are some things that, not that it was bad, it was just I think it could have been improved, and I go back and I fix it, and the next time I do it, it's great. So I would highly suggest filling in this section after a lesson is completed. So let's move on. So at this point, I've taken you through a filled out Danielson lesson plan, and I've taken you through the Danielson lesson plan template. And I just want to reinforce here, and I'd be remiss to say that, just because we've gone over this, and these are examples of, good lesson planning ideas or tactics, it doesn't mean that this template is the end-all be-all of all lesson planning that you should do. It simply is just that, if you're getting evaluated on the Danielson framework, this does encompass all aspects of what Danielson considers quote-unquote good teaching. Just imagine someone doing air quotes there. So to be clear, this is not the only way that you can do lesson planning. There are other ways to go about it, which I'm about to show you. So here I have a lesson plan that's actually one that I did when I teach Things Fall Apart. An English teacher, like I said before, and again, it encompasses all of these things that actually make up the the Danielson lesson plan. So this is a lesson plan about symbolism and Things Fall Apart, and you have your aim, your leading discussion questions, which encompasses the aim, the objectives, the resources, the timing, the vocabulary that's going to be addressed, the Common Core Learning Standard, which is super necessary. It goes through the lesson plan itself, even talks about a transition. The transition here supplements a mini lesson. The development supplements the activities that are taking place that you were talking about before. This is where students are actually doing their group work activity, which is described later on. And there's a summary, which is the answer of the aim. So you have the explanations and rationale. Again, the example I gave before was a super detailed example of the Danielson lesson plan filled out, but it does not have to always be that way. Symbolism in a chip as Things Fall Apart. Here we have group work activity that is handed out, and we have the differentiation as a result of that, which is explained in the grouping and assessment. So some has more than others for specific reasons and specific purposes. Notice how some has distinctive qualities to help out groups, and some have considerations. You were to read the lesson plan, you also have in there, you'd find that throughout the lesson, students are also given these differentiated activities in folders. And the reason that they're given these differentiated activities in folders is because the grouping of the class is grouped by ability level. They're grouped homogeneously. Therefore, students are given higher level topics like this one, rain and drought, and they're given it on a folder that is already having that activity in it on their desk. So students that are higher level that sit at their desk see that, and it looks no different than the folder at the next desk, which could be this, which is more for the middle range of the class, as it gives the distinctive qualities to help guide their thoughts. So this way, students actually are unaware that they're given different activities, and that's also really good to be mindful of as you give differentiated instruction, because you never want some students to feel like they're not good enough if they didn't get the more complex task. You really want your classroom to be a fair and democratic environment. So that's all I have for you as far as lesson planning is concerned for today. But if you have any questions, feel free to email me. My email is cbasias@gmail.com. C as in cat, B-A-S as in Sam, I-A-S as in Sam @gmail.com. and ask me any questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. Hope you enjoyed this video, everybody. Take care.